Hi everyone. So Kibby and I are actually going to we're going to kind of give a follow-up for some of the episodes we've done lately, because one of the big themes when talking about how to help our friends and family who are struggling with mental health is to talk about how to help ourselves and how to make sure that our needs are being met and that boundaries are in place in order to, effectively help them. A lot of times it can feel like when we talk about what it's like to be a loved one of someone with mental illness, we talk about the struggles and how difficult it can be, and that's all true. But what actually makes the relationship work is if you take care of yourself, you kind of put that oxygen mask on before helping others. And it just makes you a more effective friend. It makes you more effective at extending help if your needs and boundaries, which is the title of today's episode, are being met. So today we're going to answer some questions I got from you all. We're also going to go through some DBT skills called the Dear Man skills. We're going to talk about what it's like to know that your boundaries are being effectively maintained, and then how to assert your boundaries. And then Kibby and I might riff a little bit on some questions or some personal anecdotes. So Kibby, how do you know that your boundaries are being effectively maintained? How do you know that you're getting your needs met and that you're in a healthy relationship?
This is a good question, because I don't think there's any one. I think we'd like to think that, everyone should have this boundary. No one should put up with this. This is the deal breaker, right? And I don't think it's that simple. I think everyone might have different boundaries, like day by day, relationship by relationship, or year by year. Boundaries, I think, do change over time, and they should. We should be flexible with what we're willing to put up with and what we can't anymore, kind of based on our resources, like how much energy do we have, how much motivation do we have. But I think that one sign of when our boundaries are getting crossed over time is this feeling of this new concept that I've been hearing about more often. It's called caregiver burnout. And burnout in general is a feeling of, it kind of feels like depression, but it's like loss of motivation, loss of feeling of efficacy, kind of cynicism, kind of depersonalization, where you don't really feel like yourself. So at the most extreme levels, you might have this burnout, caregiver burnout, in response to having someone in your life that you love with mental health issues. Your attention might go to supporting them and their needs. And you might do whatever you can just to get them healthy, or to get them, or to, maintain the relationship. But over time, that might drain your resources, right? That might be draining. It might be exhausting. It might be leading you to ignore your needs. And so I think having a lot of self-awareness and kind of pausing and thinking, how am I doing? How am I doing in baseline? Like, when I think about helping my loved one, do I feel motivated or do I dread it? Do I have an overall feeling of optimism and motivation and sense of purpose in my life, or am I feeling a little bit dimmer these days? So those are, signs of caregiver burnout, but everyone feels differently. Irritability could be one, problem sleeping could be another, feeling like you don't have enough resources for your other relationships in your life, right? Your work, your kids, your friends. So things like that, those are kind of signs, and they're all individual signs for you of what a burnout would feel like.
Yeah, I read a quote that Russell Brand posted recently. I don't know if anyone knows this about me, but I love Russell Brand.
I didn't know that about you.
You would never think.
I don't know about that. I'm not surprised at all. Continue.
Yeah. It was something like, love someone in a way that makes them feel free. And that's not an exact metric, but that really hit me, because I think when I've noticed problems within my own relationship or with other friends, it's when I don't feel free. And that doesn't mean free to go do anything I want, but it's kind of like a freedom that I feel in my chest. Like, am I feeling constricted? Am I feeling like there's, tentacles around me pulling me down into the bottom of the ocean? Like, there's just this sort of sense of of heaviness and constriction that I can feel when I'm in an interaction or a relationship that is crossing my boundaries. So I'm not someone who actually pays enough attention to my body, but I'm kind of trying to. And I think you can sort of tell sometimes whether your needs are being met based off of Do you feel that constriction in your chest? Do you feel that heaviness? Do you ever, I don't know, I'm kind of riffing.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good description. I'm kind of like sitting with that description right now. I'm thinking about it. Yeah, I think also the times that I felt like a caregiver burnout or feel like that I was not prioritizing my needs as much and prioritizing supporting a loved one. I feel like, yeah, that kind of like not free, feeling restricted, feeling like I can't fully express and grow in my own self. That I felt almost kind of like a sense of walking on eggshells, sometimes very acutely, like, oh gosh, I can't say the wrong thing otherwise. But eggshells in the sense of like, I can't spontaneously be myself in my home or in my life without worrying that it might negatively impact this person. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good description. This is a very personal topic for me because as I've talked about before, my mom struggled with alcoholism. And so there was a lot of attention to her needs and her struggles and where she was that day. And I kept I think people in response to that, loved one, built a lot of resiliency. Like it's not an accident that a lot of people who've had parents or loved ones with a mental health issue tend to become like therapists or healthcare workers or something, because we've learned to just be resilient and think, okay, I could just function, I could just work, and all my giving attention will go to these other people. And so we kind of become like people pleasers in a way. And we get very good at it, right? It becomes part of identity and pride. And unfortunately, that happens a lot in my romantic relationships too. I feel like I tend to overextend myself in ways that over time really wear away at relationships. So I'll set a boundary. I'd say, hey, I think it's really important that you do X, Y, Z, or give me this or that, and this is very important. And because of different reasons, that might not be met in the relationship. And I think especially over time, what that would lead to, if you constantly have your needs unmet, it leads to resentment, right? And we might be thinking that we're helping the relationship or helping even ourselves by giving, but ultimately what that does is wears away at the relationship. We say this in DBT all the time. If we prioritize the relationship over our own self-respect over and over and over again, it does wear away at the relationship. You start to feel a distance. You start to feel resentment and maybe bursts of anger towards that person, or even like a disgust and kind of a pulling away. So, I mean, that's really happened a lot with me in the context of having romantic partners with who struggle with depression, for example, who they have trouble being motivated, doing things around the house, a bunch of other stuff. And so I will be like, hey, can you help with this? And that need isn't met and nothing happens. And then it gets into that cycle. So, yeah, I feel that very personally.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I think, a fairly common quote in couples counseling, which is the things that initially draw us to someone are often the things that create problems later on. I think the same can kind of work in the slight reverse, which is the dynamic we're comfortable creating in the beginning can then wind up being a dynamic that becomes really uncomfortable later. So like, Kibby, I know you're someone who gives a lot. You have a lot to give. You're very competent. You have a lot of confidence. And so I think you kind of can like give a lot up front in relationships, and that's amazing. But the problem is that some people then can like abuse that over time. I can think of couples where it's they co-create something where because one person's really good at something, the other person that almost atrophies in them. Mm-hmm. Because the dynamic is like, oh, it's almost like competitive advantage. Like I have this ability, but you have it better than me, and so I'm just gonna rely on you to give this. I think where it kind of shows up in my relationships is I think a lot of men can be drawn to me because I'm independent and free-spirited and open-minded a lot in the beginning, and then later that causes an incredible amount of anxiety on their part. I've had men look through my phones, looking for evidence of cheating, getting really uncomfortable about my sexual past, asking me questions, mining for information. And, it's like they are so drawn to these things in the beginning. And then as they're looking for more and more commitment, that can that can make them insecure. And then suddenly my boundaries are being impeded upon because I'm having to answer for my past. I'm having to watch out for what I say. I'm not comfortable around them. So yeah, so these dynamics can get really interesting because what works in the beginning doesn't work later on.
Yeah, and I think this is a interesting point that you bring up. Now that you're talking about it, it's like, how much do we change ourselves for these people, right? Like, how much do we relent and give in, and how much can we step back? So for example, if your partner was feeling super anxious about that, when someone has a mental health issue, especially anxiety or depression, that could kind of dominate relationships sometimes. It's super intense, right? So everyone wants to reduce it. And so you're like, to make your lives easier, to reduce anxiety, people tend to reassure, right? Oh no, it's fine. I'm not, whatever. They reassure that person. That reduces anxiety. But then over time, if you're reassuring or then tampering down something about yourself over and over to like reduce their anxiety, that becomes an unhealthy dynamic too, because you're doing that sacrifice in order to help them with their mental health struggle. So, I mean, there's no easy answer. There's no like, oh, as soon as you do this, stop. It's really paying attention to over time, like thinking, okay, is this wearing away like my baseline feeling towards this person or the relationship or myself?
I feel like I'm actually someone who edges too far into the boundary domain where I'm just like, I set up pretty strict boundaries, and that's part of my more avoidant attachment style is I really protect a feeling of privacy around myself. A lot of couples have an open phone policy. I swear on whoever's grave, I will never have that policy in my relationship. I'm, very protective of having a world where it's just me, it's independent, I maintain some friendships. And I think a lot of people would consider that too boundaried. Other people really love that sense of more sort of a sense of merging. And so, I mean, it's funny because I think when you're trying to figure out your own boundaries, I mean, you really have to go back to that sense of comfort. And that's going to be different for everybody. And you're maybe going to have to look for people or be friends with people who are comfortable with the boundaries that you set and with the approach to boundaries that you have. And I think I think they have pros and cons. I think a really boundaried style like I have allows me to be friends with a lot of people because for instance, one thing I hear a lot is, how do you get rid of toxic friendships? I think what a toxic friendship often is a friendship without boundaries, or where one person is abusing the boundaries of another person. So I'm actually able to be friends with narcissists, sociopaths, whoever, because I'm very boundaried. And I wasn't always this way, and I got hurt, and I was impeded upon, and it felt really terrible, and so I set up more structures. It results in me feeling like I can have a lot of healthy relationships with a really big variety of people. But the other side is that I don't maybe get some of that closeness and intimacy that some other people who are like less boundaried get. So I think there's kind of a trade-off there.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about this as therapists. It's easier to set a boundary early and very clearly. The best way to do it is whatever boundaries you set, to really communicate that effectively and clearly to someone else, right? If you have a boundary that someone has to figure out by like trial and error, that causes way more conflict and confusion than saying, hey, this is what I'm okay with, but I'm not okay with this up front. And then it's easier to flex a boundary later than it is to impose a boundary later by starting out more flexibly. So like as therapists, for example, we do this all the time where we say come on time to sessions. And that's our boundary. Like we start saying, in order to do this therapy, you have to come on time and it'd be 50 minutes or whatever. And then it's easier to then, okay, so they're running late. It's fine, it's okay. But it's much harder to say, oh, come whenever. And then later on say, hey, you've been late, the past like several sessions. So now, it's like, so setting the boundary early and being very clear about it is a lot easier than setting a boundary much later after someone has messed up a couple times,
Yeah, I think this is one of the problems with relationships that start really quickly and are really fiery in the beginning, which is kind of funny because Claire's season just ended and started with a new one on The Bachelor. Sorry, Bachelor reference. But, when you like go into, when you're leading with heart and infatuation, and I do this and it leads to problems later, then you kind of forget about the boundaries. You're like, what boundaries? Who cares?
Right,
and then you have to assert them later. And then that causes all sorts of anxiety and a lot of misunderstandings. So I agree. And I should have been better about that throughout my life.
Well, it takes learning about yourself, right? It takes learning about what your boundaries are and what you can manage and still feel like yourself, still feel like motivated and in the relationship and committed, and what would just wear away at that, right? So, right. And it's different for every person.
Right. I think I got a lot of questions on Instagram about like, what are boundaries? Like, what are good boundaries? What are work boundaries? What are relationship boundaries? And I think to your earlier point, there aren't any set in stone boundaries. Like a boundary that I make early on in all relationships is I'm going to be friends with my exes. If I've dated someone in the past, I'm not going to get rid of that relationship just because I'm dating you now. And it causes strife, but it's one that I stick to. And, saying it clearly up front kind of forces you to value it later. But that's, a lot of people wouldn't be comfortable with that at all. Some people would be, if you've dated someone in the past, you're still friends with them, I can't do that. And that's okay too. So what are boundaries is kind of different. We can't answer that question, but.
I do have to say though, even though boundaries are flexible, one thing, at least in therapy, that we talk about is if someone, like a loved one with mental health struggles, is threatening your safety or life, that is something that is like, okay, that should be a boundary that's set. For example, if the loved one is struggling with PTSD or depression or any other serious mental health issues and hits their partner, no go, right? Because what the difference there is that it changes the power dynamic so much that you're no longer treated as equals in the relationship, right? Like if someone is threatening your physical safety, you're not going to be treated like an equal partner who could set boundaries and is respected for those boundaries. Already you're afraid of for your life. So of course, all of your behaviors, all of your decisions are going to be for survival. And that's a very different dynamic that should merit like pretty strong boundaries.
I would say the same thing about insults, actually. I think insults, I mean, whatever, we all have our different levels for accepting some of that, but it's a very clear kind of, I am not going to respect you, or I'm going to attempt to hurt you. I think when you can tell someone is attempting to hurt you, your patience should get shorter. Because it's a very clear sign that like your boundaries don't matter to me, at least not in this moment. And therefore you can't necessarily trust that your boundaries will matter to me later. So yeah, I think when it comes to like actual threats to your physical safety, and I would say an insult is kind of a threat to emotional safety. It's also just a signal that, yeah.
Yeah, I think anything that wears away your self-respect and feeling like yourself and your safe, free self over time, that's something to be like, this is something that I have to stop. This is something that I shouldn't tolerate anymore, and communicate to the other person that I'm not willing to accept that. So
the DBT lists sort of 3 domains, right, for relationships to.
Yeah, so in DBT, in the interpersonal effectiveness module, they have a really nice framework for thinking about 3 different priorities you can have in interpersonal situations. One is the objectives priority, which means that getting what you want or accomplishing something, right? If you're in a marriage and you need to get your kid to school, right? That's the objectives, right? The second priority is the relationship. So how that other person feels about you, right? You could get that kid to school or not, but it's like, does your husband like you and respect you and think you're a nice person to be around? Or number 3 is self-respect, how you feel about yourself. So whether the kid gets to school, whether your husband's happy with you or not, but how do you feel like you acted in a way that you, in line with your values, in a way that you respect? So the thing is that we highlight those 3 different priorities because sometimes people have a pattern of prioritizing one of those over the others consistently, right? So if someone is the kind of person who only focuses on what they want and getting what they want, other people probably don't like them. And then over time, they don't feel great about themselves. So they realize that they're just pretty selfish. No, I'm just kidding. But, and I think it comes up a lot with people, especially people with loved ones with mental health issues, that they prioritize the relationship more often than the other stuff. So they go, okay, it's fine. I could take it as long as that person is not anxious anymore or not depressed or not as angry and violent anymore. I'll do whatever as long as they're happy, as long as they get to a better place, whatever. And over time, that really can lead to resentment, because if you prioritize the relationship, you might have to sacrifice the other stuff. You might have to sacrifice self-respect or getting stuff done, getting what you need.
Yeah.
So
you also can't just have 2 out of 3. I feel like I had relationships in the past where there was something I felt like the other person could give me. And so I was more submissive in the relationship or deferent, and I got a lot out of it, but I was missing the self-respect. And I think kind of one of the relationships you were talking about with your romantic partners is a little bit of like, I don't necessarily know that you respected yourself less. Maybe the relationship was maybe good, but you weren't getting what you needed out of it. And then in turn, that later degrades self-respect probably.
It's really confusing because I generally think of myself as someone with a lot of self-respect and confidence. But in the scenario where I'm in a relationship with someone, especially if someone says I'm struggling with mental health, right? My ultimate, soft spot. Someone says, yeah, I'll give an example, and then we can use this to illustrate Dear Man. But so something that I struggle with my partner a lot is that when he was depressed, I tend to do like some of the caretaking. Like I would get dinner most of the nights. Mm-hmm. And I would ask very subtly or gently, or probably not even that clearly, but that, can you, I wanted him to make dinner sometimes too for me. And if, the person is struggling with depression or something, then I tend to prioritize the relationship by saying, okay, it's fine. I could get my dinner myself. It's not a big deal. Right. As long as he's okay. And I know that he's struggling and whatever. It felt relatively easy for me to just do the short term goal of like, I just want dinner and I just want to not to put that much pressure on the other person. But over time, that did lead to resentment. Over time, I felt uncared for. And it took a while for me to recognize that feeling. It's kind of this feeling of like bitterness when I would get dinner. So I think that I tend to sacrifice my self-respect in that scenario because I sacrifice what I needed to feel cared for.
Yeah, it kind of seems like if one is initially missing, then the other 2 are going to crumble.
Yeah, you balance the 3 of them. It's not like you could perfectly get all 3 priorities. That's why they're called priorities. So sometimes you have to just prioritize like getting the stuff done and not caring what they think of you, what you think of yourself. But if you notice that you're prioritizing one consistently in a relationship or many relationships, you might have to shift to focusing on the other ones.
So one thing that comes up, I think very often, for instance, with substance abuse. So for the person I talked about in the substance abuse episode, if someone has mental health struggles, they're going to go through dips where they're kind of not able to be a good friend. And during those dips, if you want to prioritize the relationship long term, you're probably going to be overstepping your own boundaries a little bit to be there for them. But then to maintain it over time, I feel like it can get really easy to get stuck in this like, okay, now that you're better, like I want some fucking flowers. Like I want bring out the parade. Like you owe me now. Anything you would say in that situation? Because I'm not entirely sure.
I think that I struggle with that a lot. I don't know the answer. I think it's hard to balance that, because when someone does come back and they're finally able to kind of make amends or do something, it might be a smaller amount because, especially with someone with depression, right? For example, if they are doing something, it's taking a lot of effort for them, right? It takes them, even just a small gesture for them would be probably a lot. And for you have so much resentment or anger or whatever that it might not feel like enough, but you still have to reinforce and celebrate that they're trying, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the problem is that over time, you might feel even more and more numb or jaded, and to the point where the coming back doesn't feel as rewarding as before. Right. And that's how you know that, I mean, that's where therapists are actually really helpful, right? Because they could be in that role of helping them through the coming back to being their, their fullest, most caring self. And you don't have to be the one who's like, I'm going to, first of all, like deal with my own pain and resentment, and also celebrate what your attempts. So I think that's a really good question, but really, really hard. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I guess it's one that you can't fully answer, because sometimes the answer is you end the relationship.
Yeah.
And that's okay too. Okay, so there is a DBT skill called the Dear Man. And it's another acronym, and it goes through how to effectively set a boundary or say no. So I think Kibby's going to walk us through the Dear Man. So
Dear Man is one of my favorite DBT skills because it's so flexible. You can use it for so much. It's basically a framework to how to, if you're like, oh, I want to ask someone for something or ask them to not do something, right? Assert yourself. How do I do that? What do I say? And if people are not used to asserting themselves and asking for their needs, it could sometimes come out in like a angry, emotional mess, and then they get shut down, and then they're like, "See, no one does what I want." So this is just a really nice way to break down what you might say and kind of frame it up in your head so that you feel confident coming in, communicating most effectively what you need or what kind of boundary you want to set. So I will use an example. When I teach it in groups, I'll use an example of asking my husband to make me dinners sometimes, right? Like I was feeling resentful that I was making or getting most of the dinners, and in my head I was like, oh, like why doesn't he just know to do this for me, right? But I wasn't really communicating it. So this is a nice framework to think about how to say something like that. So.
By the way, it's Dear Man, not the deer. I think because I always think of a man with a deer head, but it's actually DEAR.
Like Dear Man. That's like a letter. Man. So, okay. I'll just jump right in. Okay. Dear Man. So the first letter in Dear Man is D for describe. So when you are asking someone for something, you probably have a lot of high emotions, and it might be hard to just describe what's the problem very clearly. But here you basically have to describe the current situation and stick to the facts, almost kind of like you're describing like a scene of a crime, right? Super objective, just the facts, no judgment, no opinions, no emotion. So for example, the way the D for describing my situation would have been, I've gotten dinner every day for the past 2 weeks, and you haven't gotten dinner for me in those past 2 weeks, right? So the reason why that's so important is to be very objective, is that you can describe the facts in a way that both parties can agree to, right? If I say, you don't care because you don't make dinner, you can see how that would start the conversation out with an argument, because the person is like, no, that's untrue. So you describe the facts of the situation in a very objective way, okay? That's D. And then E, the next one is E for express. That's when you could express how that's making you feel, right? So you separate the two out, describing the situation very objectively, and then describing how it makes you feel. A lot of I statements here. When you don't get me dinners, I feel kind of overtaxed. I feel uncared for. I feel really bummed and a little bit angry, right? So the best way to do that is make sure that you're not super heated when you say that, but just say like, I feel really hurt. Like I feel disregarded.
The funny thing is that plays into D also, because those are facts. When you stick to your own emotional experience, those are facts. Instead of being like, you're selfish and you don't care about me. Those aren't facts.
Right. You're taking judgments, especially about them and their feelings, out, right? You haven't brought dinner, that's why you don't care. You're taking that out, because then they get defensive. So really this Dear Man helps people enter the conversation where there's like less defensiveness, less argumentation, and more like, this is what happened, this is how I feel about it. Okay. So The next one is A for assert or ask. And this is asserting yourself by asking what you want or saying no clearly. And this is sometimes the hard part. Sometimes you might want to start here when you start thinking of this. Don't assume that others will figure out what you want, right? Don't leave the D and the E there and just saying, well, you fix it, right? They do this in the couples therapy a lot too. You're really clearly and very objectively saying what you want to see differently, behaviorally specific, right? So it would be like, in this next week, can you get dinner 3 nights this week? Right? So there's a way that both of you will know if that's happening, if your thing that you're asserting or asking for is actually going to happen, right? And then the last one is R for reinforce. So this is especially to help with if you're in a situation where the person doesn't necessarily see why they would do what you want. The reinforce is to tell them, like, what is the reward? What is the outcome? Why are they going to do this? What's reinforcing for them? So it's like explaining the positive effects of you getting what you want or need. So, and also this is clarifying the negative consequences, right? So if I say, hey, can you make me dinner 3 times a week, but then nothing will change if he does or doesn't, why would he, right? So it's like, so for reinforce, it could be, because then I will feel a lot more cared for, and then I can feel more motivated to just kind of be there for you, and I won't feel so drained and tired at the end of the day. Like, it would be really important for me if you make dinner like 3 times a week, right? So I'd be less irritable towards you, right? All those things are reinforced to kind of explain what the outcome would be if you get what you're asking for. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay.
So we had a question from a follower that asked, what if someone lashes out when you assert your boundaries?
Yeah. So this is where the man comes in, right? The deer is just the plain framework, was the thing that you start out with. And what that would look like in summary would be, hey, partner, in the past 2 weeks, I've made dinner every night. And you haven't made dinner any night in these past 2 weeks. It's making me feel really uncared for. It's making me really feel drained, and kind of tired and a little bit hurt. So would you mind making dinner 3 nights a week in this next week? If you do that, I like, it would mean a lot to me. I would feel so much better. I would be less snippy around you, and I'll have like more time to focus on other things and relax a little bit. So I think it will be better overall. But then if you have someone, and hopefully that goes well, right? But then if you have someone who does argue against it or lash out or express anger, which is really common, the man is where that comes in. So the M is to stay mindful. So keep focus on your goals, maintain your position, don't get distracted, don't get off topic. It's kind of like stay on broken records. Go to your assert over and over again, right? If someone goes, well, you never do this, and you don't do the laundry, and I, blah, 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 then the M would be, I understand, validate, and would you mind making dinner 3 times next week, right? We could feel a little bit strange because it kind of sounds like rote, but it at least like it stays on your assert. It doesn't back down. It doesn't let you just like throw your assert away or just overshadow what you're asking for. You stay on topic. And then A in man is appear confident.
I love this one. Don't have to be confident.
Not be confident. It's appear confident. So yeah, I mean, use a confident voice and tone. Look them straight in the eye. Have a calm voice. Make good eye contact. Don't look down or apologize a whole bunch of times or start to say, no, Ash, you're right. Never mind. Maybe just once. If you just give me dinner once, right? Like, don't shuffle around there. Be really confident. Ask for what you need. Even if you have to practice this with somebody else first, and really somehow get in your mind that you deserve what you're asking for, which is sometimes the hard part. But once you get there, don't apologize in yourself for it. Ask for what you want. Appear confident.
Yeah, the apology thing, I think, is something that women especially do. Apologizing for things that they should not be apologizing for because they didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
It's something actually my supervisor goes over with me, and all of us, because there are often times when we have to assert boundaries with patients, and apologizing for that kind of defeats the purpose. It sort of hands them ground when it's like, actually, this is very reasonable and necessary. You can still be nice.
You would communicate that you have done something wrong by asking it, right?
Right.
I'm sorry, but can you please make me dinner? You're already saying I'm doing something wrong by asking, and that communicates, just a lack of confidence, and it just lets the other person say no.
Yeah.
And the last one is N for negotiate. So be willing to give to get. That's what it says in the skill. And if there are reasons that the person cannot meet your need, right? If you can't make dinner 3 nights a week, we're going away, or he's busy that night or something like that, then you do work with that person. You stay on broken record, ask for what you need, but you might need to negotiate a little bit. So you could turn the tables and ask them for solutions. Like, okay, if making me dinner 3 nights next week doesn't work, what do you think we should do? What can you do? What are you willing to do?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a tricky part, because that's opening it up to moving that boundary. So you might have to think in yourself before you do this, like, what is my bottom line? Like, what would be acceptable for me to accept from them? What wouldn't, even in that moment or over time. But yeah, it's a balance of being firm yet flexible. So here you work with that person, you collaborate with them to meet your need in a way that is feasible for them.
I don't know what to say besides perfect. I don't know. I think just to kind of, sum up, it's, hey, I've noticed that over the past, 2 weeks, I've made dinner every night, and you haven't made dinner. I've been feeling kind of worn out and a little bit uncared for, and just kind of exhausted. And it would really mean a lot to me if you would make dinner a few times a week. And then, if you can make dinner a few times a week, I really feel like that would so help our relationship, because I wouldn't be exhausted and I wouldn't be snippy. And this is just something I've noticed that is kind of wearing me out, and I feel like it would be good for both of us. So that's reinforcing.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's also nice to hear it from your voice, because you said things slightly differently. And it doesn't have to come out in the exact same way. It could be a little bit more fluid. It could be shorter. It could be longer. You could write it out in an email, right? There's many different ways to use the Dear Man. The one thing I would tweak in what you just said was, you said, can you make dinner a few nights next week?
Oh, 3 nights. Specificity, right?
Specificity, yeah.
Yes.
Because what happens is that if the person does it like once or twice, and you were actually looking for something else, this is where a lot of people kind of mess up Dear Man, where they think they're being really clear. They're like, can you do this sometimes? And then the person does it like once or twice, which is literally sometimes. And then the person is still resentful. And then everyone's upset, right? So being super clear to the point where at the end of that week, or the end of them trying to attempt to do your ask, both of you can say, yes, it happened, or no, it did not happen. So that's what I would say about that.
Awesome. So someone said that setting boundaries can sometimes be abused as a way of terminating an important conversation. So if that happened, so for instance, like, I'm not willing to talk about this. You're just nagging me again. I need my space. Bye. What would you say? The interesting thing is that sometimes that's true. Like, sometimes a conversation can feel abusive, but sometimes sometimes it can be used in the reverse. Somebody has a really reasonable request, and the other person's like, sorry, I'm not willing to do that, or I'm not willing to even have this conversation. And then they just walk out. And
so you're talking about what is like for the other person on the other end of someone setting a boundary for you, right? And it's like, that's something really important. And it's hard because you could have a boundary that you need to talk about something really,
right.
really important. I think couples therapy, family therapy is really important there to be able to, to negotiate those terms again, like so one person can be flexible with their boundaries, the other person, and meet the other person's need, or vice versa, and what makes sense. But also with boundaries, like if that's something that someone sets and you're not okay with it over time, that might be a sign that like this relationship is not really in line with my values, right? Then that person could choose that this is not okay with them. So again,
yeah, I'm sure we'll do an entire episode on ending relationships, but
yeah, that's a good idea.
I mean, the reality is that setting boundaries is a way of maintaining relationships, and sometimes it's a clue that the relationship shouldn't be maintained. So if there is sort of an abuse of being unwilling to even hear the other person's boundaries, then
yeah,
it is what it is.
I think it's worth also looking in yourself. You notice that your boundaries are constantly being crossed, and you keep having to change it. Mm-hmm. And you can't even fathom the idea of walking away from the relationship. That's something to think about, because there might be some fear there. Mm-hmm. There might be some fear of like being alone, being without that person, that's binding you to constantly be in a position of sacrificing your needs and self-respect. So think about that,
Okay, well, for now, remember Dear Man without the, unless you like that image better. And please, if you enjoy our podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe. Love those reviews. And I'm sure I will hear from some of you in the coming weeks with more questions. And we hope you listen next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.